and welcome to yet another episode of the Unconnected.org webinar series powered by our sponsors at the GSR Foundation. I'm your host, Danny Weiser, and as always, I'm very excited to have you join us for what promises to be an insightful and engaging discussion on the intersection of digital transformation, public service delivery, and the critical role of bridging digital divide within governance and civil society. In the evolving landscape of digital governance, integrating technology to deliver public services effectively and inclusively is obviously crucial. And as governments across the world increasingly start to digitize, the need for populations to be able to access and confidently navigate these emerging technologies, of course, increases. And yet, at the same time, there are fears that there are people who are being left behind in doing so. And so to discuss this today, I'm over the moon to be joined by four esteemed guests who bring diverse experience to the conversation and will hopefully allow us to explore both the challenges posed by the digital divide in terms of e-governance, as well as also the successes achieved when digital public services are implemented correctly. So, first, I am honoured to introduce Mohammed Seer, who is a seasoned expert in bringing digital innovation to government services, with over 12 years' experience in the UK government. Mohammed then transitioned to the private sector, where he spent the last 2 decades helping governments across the world become more citizen-centric. His work spans across the UK, the Middle East, Australasia, South Asia, and he's focusing on improving public services through transformation and design thinking has been something which has been really global. So Mohammed's insights into enhancing citizen experiences by digitizing services make him a valuable voice in our discussion today. So thank you for joining us, Mohammed. Next, we have Miranda Sharp, who is an independent consultant who collaborates with businesses and public authorities on the new business models emerging from treating data as an asset. Miranda also serves as a non-executive director and advisor to various enterprises and government departments. So her experience in leveraging data to drive innovation and efficiency in public services will also provide, I'm sure, critical insights into our conversation on digital inclusion. So thank you for joining as well, Miranda. Next up, from Belgium today, from Leuven, we have joining us Armen Gasparian, who is an Armenian PhD student at KU Leuven, researching public service delivery rather, in Armenia, with a specific focus provided by local governments. This year, in fact, Armen published a paper titled From Paperwork to Pixels, Workload and Digital Governance in Armenian Local Authorities, which examines the impact of amalgamation reforms on workload and digital governance. His research highlights the transition towards e-governance as a strategy to mitigate increased workloads with varying levels of success, I think it's fair to say, across different communities. So Armen's academic and practical perspectives on local government services and digital transformation will be instrumental in our discussion, and I have no doubt that his engagement at a number of international and local organizations and his passion for development work make him yet another interesting voice on the panel. And last but certainly not least, joining us from Kenya today, we have David Lemayan, who is founder and principal of Tenery Research. David is an ICT expert who specializes in supporting research institutions, nonprofits, governments, policymakers, and journalists in shaping their digital strategies. So David helps architect and build secure data-driven tools for citizen engagement, process optimization, and analysis. So his work in integrating product, data science, and software engineering into decision-making processes will, of course, shed light on how technology can be harnessed to improve public services and, of course, promote digital inclusion. Now, a very fairly lengthy introduction, but a worthy one for each guest, and I'm sure you would love to hear from the guests themselves now. Enough from me. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of a relationship between e-government and the digital divide, let's kick off with our typical opener question, which is, what does meaningful digital connection look like to you? David, let's start with you. What does meaningful digital connection look like?
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for such an introduction. It's an honor to really be on a webinar with all of these distinguished guests. So, for me, I think the meaningful digital inclusion has two parts to it. One is definitely accessibility. It's about meeting people where they are. In terms of the kind of devices they're using, the kind of access to infrastructure that they have, in terms of even something as simple as basic as electricity. We need to be able to consider that in terms of digital inclusion. So we have to get the basics right. And then number two, in terms of digital inclusion, is about fairness and equity. So here we're talking about fair and equitable digital access, but also digital sort of like setup. So here we're talking that whatever that we're setting up, not only in the global north, but also in the global south, it should have factors of consideration of climate change, of water usage, of environmental factors, such that the digital inclusion and being able to create all these digital tools does not mess something else for someone else in another country. Here, of course, we're talking about the kind of AI servers that we're seeing being spun up, that while they are reaping benefits for the global north, the global south is paying by the climate change. So digital inclusion I see as those two key factors: accessibility and fairness.
Thank you, David. And I'm sure we're definitely going to be getting into both of those areas of accessibility and fairness in reference to e-governance today. So yeah, thank you for raising those 2 points. Armin, let's turn to you. What does meaningful digital connection look like to you?
Okay. I'll also start by thanking you, Danny, for the invite and for being on this being here with so many distinguished people. I think that what David presented to us resonates a lot with me. I'll just add a few things to his definition. From my perspective, I think the core of this idea is to increase the quality of life, and especially the quality of life of people who are most disenfranchised, the most disconnected people from most remote communities, most in need communities, to ensure that we are trying to bridge the gap between wealthiest and poorest parts of a society, that we are, as was just mentioned, moving towards a more equitable society. And I'll just coin the word inclusive here. I think when David was speaking about the tools that they are being used, being mindful of the different approaches, the different ways of that people prefer to receive information, I think we should also strive to ensure that while we move towards more connectivity, while we move towards more effective distribution of data, more efficient distribution of data, we don't forget about the inclusivity, so that the people who are actually most in need for the services are oftentimes the ones that are neglected most for the sake of being more efficient, for the sake of being more effective, for covering more ground. So I think while that is important, not forgetting about these segments of the society is a lot more important as well.
Thank you, Armin. And look, I look forward to kind of hearing specifically about the Armenian context later today, in terms of what it looks like there, in terms of how fair, how equitable our services kind of being distributed. But yeah, again, very, very, very wise points you've raised, and I'm sure we're going to get into all of that more in the discussion. Miranda, let's turn to you now. What does meaningful digital connection look like to you?
Well, thank you for asking. And again, I'd like to add my thanks to my fellow panelists who raised excellent points. And certainly, accessibility and fairness are two really, I would agree, are certainly very important points. And when people tend to sort of talk about this, It's quite interesting that often people get lost in the need for sort of something like connection. So typically it was about a telco connection. Often I'll talk to organizations and they'll think that that's it. And once you've got that sort of connection, then all is fair. I think I would focus on the need for equal access to information. So it's not dependent on your means of connectivity. So that the information isn't the subject of geography or location or income or rate or anything. And for that, I think we need something that gets very little attention, which is a sustainable and resilient data infrastructure. So what are the things in an economy or a society, the bits of data which are as important as a water network or as a communications network or as a transportation network? And I think we need to think about those and how they enable connection of citizens to each other, to authorities, no matter where they are.
Excellent. Thank you, Miranda. Look, I think that's a very fair point. Obviously, in certain contexts, it's very easy to kind of get bogged down into the point about access and just basic infrastructure. I mean, even David made reference before to even places in the world which don't even have electricity. So, we're obviously not talking about a level playing field here, but yeah, at the same time, once we kind of get past those kind of basic needs of accessibility, absolutely, the internet is not the same for everybody, and obviously it's different depending on what you are, and absolutely it is completely about the fair access to the information. So, are people digitally literate will be an area of discussion I'm sure we're going to be engaged with today. Are people being provided with services that are tailored to their needs in terms of language, culture, geography, all different areas? So thank you, Miranda, for raising those points. Finally, let's turn to Mohammed. Mohammed, can you tell us, what does meaningful digital connection look like to you?
It's an interesting debate and very useful and interesting points made by everyone so far. For me, this has always been an area of fascination around the space of trust and authenticity. And the reason for that is that when we are looking at digital connections or communications, we are in a borderless state. When we in our countries, different places we live, there are many rules that govern and protect the culture, the society of those nations, and also there is implication to people who put information out there that if it is false, if it's fake, if it's not authentic, then something can happen. Very much in the digital space, it's kind of like a free-for-all state. Whilst there are some boundaries, some parameters, some governing rules, these rules are not generally set by state. They are by the platforms themselves, which are being used for the communication. So it's quite easy to fake data. It's quite easy to pretend who you are and mask your identity. All of these things then can create also challenges because we have all sorts of different age groups on these digital platforms, etc. So at the end of the day, it's that kind of how can we get data, that communication to be trusted, fair, clear, as spoken earlier as well about. But trust to me is the most important factor, that anyone consuming the data or communicating with each other, they know who they're communicating with and they know they can trust the data.
So Mohammed, following on from that point about trust, when we're talking about government services, digital government services that are being provided, are we seeing examples of people just not trusting those services and not willing to use digitized versions as opposed to kind of old school paperwork versions of digital government services? Is there a degree of mistrust that exists amongst populations that you see?
There is an element of hesitation in certain parts of the world. I wouldn't say that is the case everywhere. Now, the challenge for me from a trust point of view is much broader than the government services that are being provided. It's much more to do with the social platforms that we have, the social media platforms, etc., where there is a lot more communication happening than it is. But when you come to digital services, the hesitation there or the challenge there can be digital literacy. We see in certain countries, even in European countries, some places there is a challenge with digital literacy. We do see also challenge in using these services because of access. So either access is not there because you cannot afford the access, or it's not there because it's difficult for you to access it because of maybe some impairment. You may be, a person who is visually impaired or has some challenge that they need to overcome. So when we look at digital, typically we don't think of the demographics. We just think it's the right way of doing things and we just do it. So understanding who you're serving is quite important. So those factors are there. Trust, obviously, to some extent is there because of the fact that some governments are not trusted as much as they are by their citizens. And that trust is nothing to do with just digital. It's to do with the fact that generally they don't have a trust with their government to provide the services at that. And the data will be leveraged and used in a not maybe authentic way. So that element is there as well.
In Kenya, are we seeing a rapid expansion of digital services from a government, or not quite yet?
That's a good question, Danny. I'm really glad that Mohammed actually brought up the aspect of trust, because that is such a key point on digital inclusion. When you think of the kind of violence that is meted out on different people on different platforms, it can definitely make you feel disincluded. I'm gonna give you an example here. Is when female MPs or members of parliament come onto social media platforms, they will be met with not only threats of rape, but they will be met with threats of all sorts of violence against them and their families. This is unlike the kind of violence or rather, kind of engagement that you see with male MPs. Now that pushes inclusion from the system or from the platforms that we're talking about. But when we come to governments, the same thing applies. Violence. When governments are violent towards their people, even in terms of trying to push certain agendas for digitization. Here in Kenya, we had a big push for something called the Huduma number, which was this digital ID system. However, people are pushing back because they're saying, no, this government, one, wants to spy on me. Two, they want to make sure that they can be able to track me when I am becoming a dissident. You'll see, for example, recently there were protests. The digitization, people are saying, no, the telcos are giving away my number. Now I cannot use government systems because they will then take me and arrest me. They will pick me up from my house, from wherever I am, wherever I've used a specific service, and it'll ping them. And that's the same thing that you find in different countries across the continent and across the world. If the governments themselves are violent, if the providers of the platforms themselves do not have sort of redress mechanisms for these kinds of situations, then definitely people will choose not to use the systems. So in Kenya, that's what's happening right now.
So David, so obviously, you've kind of made reference to the risks of expanding to digital services in terms of a risk of surveillance, for example, by this case of a Huduma number which you referenced. But are there also kind of risks that you're seeing in Kenya, for example, or across the continent, in terms of expansion? In terms of expansion of digital services, almost excluding large segments of the population because they actually aren't set up with basic access. What's kind of the situation in that sense, and then let's turn to Miranda.
So very quickly, it's where, for example, prejudicial systems have already created. So, for example, folk who have not been registered on the national systems are then being disenfranchised. So, for example, there are people who had, clan land, they had tribal land that's sitting somewhere, communal land. They're now being removed when these systems are being digitized. While when they were not in the digital format, they were really just owning the land and able to work on it. And as they're being digitized, they're being disenfranchised. So there are situations where that is happening. People are not being given birthrights. For example, there are folk who are here in Nairobi who have always lived and worked here, but now they can't get access to government services because they didn't have a specific national ID at a specific time, which again just creates that divide more and more. So
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Miranda, let's bring you in here.
Now I've got a couple of points now after that really interesting discussion. So there's a lovely book called The Address Book, which discusses sort of address as identity, and how giving people an address gives them identity, and which is a good and bad thing, which I think is sort of a pretty, very much like David was talking about in terms of digital numbers. I also, while we were talking about people not trusting digital services, particularly in a government setting, it's the other side of the coin from slightly over trusting. So, for example, in the UK, we have people who will trust Facebook or Meta with all sorts of data they wouldn't dream of giving to the government, and yet, of course, the security and legislative restrictions on government data in the UK are much stronger than those for private sector companies. So we as a population are not entirely consistent in our approaches, and also we might be different about different parts of government. So but it's not just failure to trust. People who overtrust and are susceptible to malcontents or bad actors are just as much of a risk, I think, as people who don't trust.
Miranda, may I then ask, obviously, I think a lot of the conversation within the digital inclusion space, arguably rightly so, speaks about the global south. But are we also seeing that digital literacy is still a major barrier, even in the global north, in countries like the UK, where people are over-trusting in that way because they're not really that equipped to distinguish between what, let's say, Facebook, for example, or Meta is doing with their data as opposed to what a government might do?
And to some extent, the trade is really clear. Turning off your Meta services has an immediate impact on you, but failure to engage with a government service, might be considered a good thing if you fear the authorities, or has no material impact because services can be provided another way. It's sort of I want to say insidious nature of digital infrastructure is that because the commercial models are slightly funny, because we expect so much we've come to depend on so many services that are provided free at the point of use. Our perception of value, it needs a new calibration.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Well, let's kind of make the kind of more positive case for digital government, digital government services. Armen, let's turn to you for this. From what you've seen, particularly looking at Armenia as a case study, how have you seen digital services as almost a tool for effective governance? Where have you seen its kind of positive side?
Thank you for the question. Okay, to start with, I would say that what I've seen is we have this annual satisfaction surveys that different nonprofits, different research organizations conduct, and we have one that's particularly particularly prominent, and there is this nationwide survey called Caucasus Barometer that has 300+ questions, and one question that always pops up is, how much to trust this or that public institution. And there have been institutions that have been traditionally trusted a lot more than others, like the church has been very trusted a lot. The National Human Rights Institution has always been in the top 3. And there are institutions like the police, like the judiciary, that are almost always at the lower end of the spectrum. But what I've noticed is that in the past few years, there has been not too strong, but still a positive trend in terms of these sort of institutions gaining more trust, and what it's associated with is increased transparency and increased accountability by these institutions. And it's known for a long period of time now that the digital tools also are closely associated with transparency. The information sharing, the fast-paced information sharing is allowing for more transparency and also more accountability. And one reform that's been particularly prominent in Armenia in that sense was within the judiciary, judges becoming more and more transparent, and not all of them, but that's still a process. And with that transparency, with creation of a number of e-governance tools, like the healthcare system has become a lot more trusted once the e-healthcare was put together. Same with the penitentiary service. Prison management has become a lot more transparent once e-prison was put together and was introduced by the government last year. So
Omen, are you saying that the kind of the key benefit from digitizing isn't necessarily speed, it's more transparency?
I would say so, yes, because I think that it's a lot easier now to track what the government is doing in this or that service, this or that sector, than it was previously. So that is contributing to increased social cohesion and increased trust. And I think at the end of the day, it's, at least to me, it's not less important than what the service actually is about. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed, I'd like to turn to you now to ask, obviously your work is kind of far-reaching across the globe. And different governments, different nations have tried different techniques to reach different standards, I suppose, different levels of standards when it comes to digital services they provide. Often people kind of refer to Estonia as almost being the gold standard within digitized government or e-governance. Is that true? It's a threefold question. Is that true? If it's not, if it is true, why is it true? What are they doing that's so great? And what can other countries kind of do to reach similar standards? Obviously, again, it's not a level playing field. A country with poor infrastructure is probably going to take a lot longer to get to where Estonia or another gold standard country might be. But I'd really like to get your take as to what should be the signs we're looking for as in terms of good e-governance.
Yeah, so Estonia definitely is one of the most advanced nations when it comes to digital. In fact, they call themselves a digital nation, which is a kind of way of how they describe their achievement. And in Estonia, you pretty much got 99 point whatever services that you have to, any interaction with government is done digitally. The only one that you can't do today is get divorced digitally. It used to be you couldn't get married digitally as well, but that's now the case. You can, but you can't get divorced digitally. And they explained to me last time I was there having a chat. I said, why? And it is because when you are divorcing, there is many implications, financial implications on that particular action. And they want to make sure that it is absolutely the real people who are deciding to separate from each other and go towards a divorce. So because the financial implications and the implications on children and other the different assets they have is profound. So that's why that one isn't for now, but everything else is. And the kind of what you could the secret sauce for them, one was that they jumped on this bandwagon of the internet very early on and decided by coincidence they were just coming out of getting independence. So it was a time when the internet was taking off, so they had very limited resources, and that became their way of competing globally in a space that everyone was equal at that time. Everyone was trying to figure out what the internet could do for them. So they made a bet and they said, we are going to cross the country in all schools, provide PCs and training. So they've grown up with technology in their blood, basically. And that's what's driven them to this. But the other factor is that, which we often kind of separate, when we talk about digital services, I do not like actually using the word digital because they're services. When we talk about digital government, it's actually government. It's nothing new you're creating. It's just a different way of how you're delivering what your core mandate is, or the services it's just tomorrow it's going to be autonomous.
So should we refer to them as digitally delivered services? Is that a term that you would kind of
it's
get
a service,
more behind?
Right?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a means, right? So we're using a particular mean to deliver a particular service. It was in person at some point, it moved towards electronic. Now we call it digital, and tomorrow we'll call it something else. So what they have done is they made sure that at the core, it's about government mandate and government service delivery. So it so happens to be in the digital age we're living in today, it is being done digitally. And so they think from that perspective. And you do see also good examples in other parts of the world. I think the region I'm sitting in now, which is the Middle East region, GCC especially, I think they are far going to be ahead of anyone else in the world in the next. I mean, they already are moving at a very fast pace. And I think in the next 5 to 6 years, probably they will be far ahead of anyone else in terms of what, because the investment going in, and they're thinking from a perspective of how do we make the user experience easy? How do we take friction out of dealing with government? How do we make it possible that any time of the day you need something, you can actually request for it? And you may get it even instantly because they've used AI or some other autonomous technology behind to enable the service delivery. It doesn't necessarily have to be going through humans to check and do stuff like that, where it's straightforward. So that's the kind of, I hope I've answered the question, but it's definitely one to look out for, Estonia, but definitely we'll find good examples everywhere and anywhere in the world. And I can cite you good examples from Africa, from Asia, everywhere there's something unique and interesting that is happening.
Okay, well, let's kind of move the conversation a little bit to Africa. I would like to know, David kind of made reference to it in his kind of opening gambit in terms of the role that infrastructure development plays in digital inclusion. My question really is kind of how can governments ensure widespread access to reliable internet widespread access to reliable internet for services in rural or even underserved urban areas to be better integrated into those kind of digital inclusion strategies, so that people can have equitable access to e-government services. Are we seeing any cases of centers or hubs being set up with, let's say, digitized government services available if perhaps individuals can't afford or have infrastructure, don't have the infrastructure for their own personal data or Wi-Fi? David, let's turn to you to answer that in the African context, but even if you can just speak more generally about the kind of the rural divide in this sense.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'm going to speak to, I think, two things from that, and reference, yes, my home country, Kenya, for this. So one is the biggest reason I think today I'm sitting here talking to you on a wonderful fiber connection out 6 hours away from the capital is because the government invested in something called Northby. This is the national fiber backbone. And what they did is they wanted to connect every single university, every single high school, and every single primary school on a fiber backbone network. And this was 10, 12, 13 years ago. So it was way back then. Now, this initiative was one of the reasons why many Kenyans that you're seeing right now are being the product of the access to the internet, access to the information that you've seen, access to the kind of developers and software talent that you're seeing today. Government played a role because private sector would not be able to do that. Safaricom at the time was working on connecting on building up cell towers, but even they wouldn't be able to build the kind of backbone that the kind of fiber network that the government has done. So government has been important in doing that. They've been important in also even investing into Safaricom, who we talk, has done digital inclusion through their financial inclusion programs through things like M-Pesa. The Kenyan government invested into that. That it wasn't specifically just a private sector that came in. The government actually put its money behind it and supported it through very favorable policies. This was everything from the Universal Service Fund, which was able to then create cell towers in very rural areas. I think that's what we were asking about. So this fund was taking money and allowing different companies to set up these cell towers, and also putting in the favorable policies and saying, okay, we will allow you to play a sandbox with these mobile money technologies so that you do not have to worry about the kind of regulations. So they really supported them by sort of like blocking the banks from coming in and trying to kill the service before it even started. So one book, and I like the recommendation on the books, is one book I like to go back to is The Entrepreneurial State. And that book really speaks about how government's role in shaping the digital strategical role in making sort of like countries and sector, and those countries really thrive. You can even speak to Nigeria as well right now with their AI strategy. It's going to be amazing work that they're doing. South Africa, even places like DRC, which is doing digital first, are really seeing positive returns.
David, I'd just like to come in there though. So obviously you're saying there are some, positive steps being made in terms of infrastructure development in rural or underserved areas. But what about affordability? Are we seeing that and digital education perhaps as major barriers to be able to access services?
Oh, wow. Yes, both are very key, and particularly affordability of the devices. We are seeing actually a very big play from Chinese phone manufacturers into the continent to provide these affordable phones. Right now, 50% of phones are right now handled by one phone manufacturer who is Chinese, and they build out the ITELs and everything. And so they're bringing the cost of device accessibility low. But we still have challenges in terms of course, data accessibility and airtime accessibility from the cost perspective that we're still grappling with. But that's coming down. That's going to come down, and we're seeing that from different collaborations from across the continent, and we're going to start manufacturing our phones also on the continent, which should improve that.
Barman, moving away from the African context, and obviously, take into account your knowledge of your home country, Armenia. Are you seeing kind of socioeconomic barriers or geographic barriers as kind of being the major kind of halt to people participating in government services online?
Yes, and that's one thing that I actually wanted to talk about myself. So to respond to this question, I'll bring you 2 examples to show how things are going. So on the one hand, the government has just launched a platform that's called Hartag.im, and Hartag translates into platform, where they've done a lot of research. They've uncovered the most important life events that every person or almost every person goes through. And one of those is, for example, childbirth. And I remember when both times when my cousin was expecting a child, their family had to go through enormous rounds of bureaucracy. There was a lot of red tape from the moment she was pregnant till she was actually to go into labor. And what the government has done is, through this new platform, all the person has to do is go to a platform, register there, tell the government that they are expecting a child, or that they are soon to get into pension age, or that some of their family members has unfortunately passed away, and there are 9 other types of life events. And you as a citizen don't have to do anything with the government anymore. So you go to a first respondent, and then the government does all sorts of bureaucracy behind the curtain, and you are just getting the service without much interference. So that means that there is a lot of red tape that's being erased. There is a lot of bureaucracy that's been curtailed, and people are getting better services at a faster pace. So that's the positive. But at the same time, when I was talking to a representative of the local government in a village, so they're almost all governments, local governments in Armenia are amalgamated, and there is a community that consists of 20 villages. Mayor sits in the biggest one, and in all 19 other villages have one representative that's appointed by the mayor. So, and I was asking, okay, how do you provide public services? And this person was telling me, okay, when a person comes in, he or she tells what the problem is. They sit in my car. We go to a titular community. We go to a municipal building. I arrange a meeting with the mayor, and the mayor gets the problem fixed. Or head of a department, and that person gets the problems fixed. And that got me confused, because I knew that there is an e-government service that exists on a municipal level. So all 20 villages are supposed to be connected, and you can just scan a document, send to the municipality, and then it is fixed. You don't need to take the physical papers with you. You don't need to drive to the main village or town or wherever. And I asked, okay, why don't you do it this way? And to that, the person responded that in a lot of cases, they do not really know how to operate things. And even when they do know, they are not sure whether the respondent from the other side is going to take a look at the document. So in practice, it's in remote communities more so, it's a lot easier to drive 20 kilometers to the main community to get the service today and now, rather than to send a scanned document and wait for weeks and weeks. So in that sense, geography and socioeconomic status, but also not less important, the capacity of people, the capacity of public servants at lower levels, the data literacy of people, because Hartag, which I mentioned, is probably going to change a lot of things, change how public service is perceived, both by servants and the people. But at the same time, there is a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of a huge segment of a society that's not aware of it. And although around 90+% of the population is connected to the internet right now, there is still, within different segments of a society, the elderly, the youngest, people who haven't received proper education, people who are experiencing problems, socioeconomic problems, the data literacy, the connectivity is a huge challenge.
I'm going to turn to Miranda in a moment to ask about emerging technologies, but first, I would like to just continue with that point, Armin, and kind of expand a little bit about how we can kind of involve communities in the design and implementation of these e-government services. Obviously, you as an academic are receiving some kind of feedback from citizens, but are the government, especially those citizens with limited digital access, that 10% that are not connected, are they kind of being effectively incorporated into the development of digital public services?
I don't want to be too radical in my response, but I think that's probably not the case. I think that's being done in a more representative way rather than a direct way. I think organizations who are created to support these segments of a society are involved in the process, but I don't think there is an ongoing stable coordination or at least a one-way communication to these people. Some of the local governments have actually introduced satisfaction surveys or needs assessment surveys for their constituencies, but even that's not too prevalent. And I think there is, in terms of data collection, in terms of understanding what the society wants in any local government, and especially what the least connected people in the society desire, that's a challenge. When I was asking people in local governments, how do you know what the problems are within your society? Do you actually consult people? Do you organize public hearings? A lot of times I would hear we don't do any of that because we are also part of this society. We are also residents of this village, so we understand what the problems of the village are. But what academia tells in these cases is people who are better connected, and although public servants in a remote village do not receive a high salary, but they live a more prestigious life at least, they are quite often disconnected from the problems that the least wealthy or least connected segment of their society has. So that's still a challenge.
Miranda, as I just mentioned, I would like to kind of bring you in to ask about, what emerging technologies hold almost the most promise for both improving digital public service delivery, but also, ones which kind of take into account the digital divide and ones which can kind of make access easier. And I don't just mean in terms of technology, in terms of, internet speeds and infrastructure, but more technologies that make government services more inclusive, perhaps ones which take into account, the fact that English is not necessarily the major language on the internet, and it's kind of a language which things are, kind of based on the internet, certainly in terms of the delivery of products. People are often excluded by language, or Mohammed raised the point before about disability, for example. Are we seeing any technologies coming through which really look exciting in terms of making digital public service delivery inclusive for those who are kind of digitally excluded at the moment?
So I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I was thinking, I remember, on these study tours that we do, I was meeting some people who had digitized their public service offering. I think it was a place in Israel, and they said, but we have taken the savings so that we have got appropriate services for people who are digitally excluded. So the risk is that, as Mohammed said, we design digital services as digital first, or we design services as digital first. But the trick is to design inclusive services that meet the needs of everybody. And so I really liked that discussion. Now, in terms of new technology, curiously, I'm quite excited about what AI is going to do. Now, there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about AI, but is this the technology, because it is in the hands of people who don't normally do technology, and because they see the benefits and frailties of engaging with something that will auto-generate content for them, is this the thing that's going to make them take data quality and data interoperability seriously? Because as people's appetite and experience with AI grows, they're going to come to realize that it's only as good as the data you put into it. And often the data that you put into AI the quality is limited by the accessibility of that data source or the interoperability. And I really hope that because it's in the hands of so many people, serious effort will have to go into improving the overall quality of data assets.
Just on a slight kind of turn in terms of the conversation, in terms of the topic, I'd like to ask, let's start with you, Mohammed. Are we seeing gender disparity in terms of use of services online, government services online?
Well, if you're talking from a perspective of whether the youth is more inclined to use government services online versus
sorry. No, a gender disparity. So
gender,
whether yes,
Yeah.
whether women are
Yeah, so-
using government services less than men, for example.
Yeah, so that is an issue, and it will continue to be an issue unless obviously properly addressed. And the issue, we see more of that in, of course, those countries where they're still considered developing nations and where women generally have been marginalized because of the models that are there. So if we look at some of the African countries or the Asian countries, by default, you know that, for example, the money, the spend on buying things is controlled by the male in the family rather than the female. So that itself then lends itself to less female having the spending power to have access to use government services, etc. And this generally what we see in the kind of gender divide is playing out in the digital space as well, because it exists. There is attempts being made to try and push that. Like I know GSMA, for example, has this as a key area of focus, and they're trying to launch many initiatives to bridge this gender divide, especially when it comes to access to connectivity. But it definitely is an issue.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think obviously, look, for us at unconnected.org, connecting women and including women in all kind of meaningful digital connection services is right at the heart of what we do, but so too is it with refugees. And I'd like to kind of ask David, considering that we've also got a big project we work on out in Kenya, Kakuma refugee camp. I'd like to ask David about the impact that digitized public services are having on refugees. Are we seeing that refugees are falling behind because the digital infrastructure, for example, in refugee camps, or digital literacy, digital education is just not there for them to be kind of included in the process to be able to, potentially get visas, to end their stateless status, or even to access other government programs. What's the impact that digitized public services are having on refugees? Are we seeing also it speeding up processes and it helping refugees? I'd like to hear both kind of sides of the coin, if you can answer that, David.
I'm going to do that shortly. Just after mentioning something in the gender digital divide, in sub-Saharan Africa, 60% of men have access to the internet, while only 30% of women on the continent have access to the internet. Here, double the number. It's just, ridiculous. So definitely something that we're trying to address and working with, of course, different partners, everything from device access to sort of like, internet access, I think is super important. I think, and then coming to the refugee situation, I will not sort of like act to know what the situation is there, because it is a lot more complex than I'd like to say that, to go into techno solutionism, sort of that technology will solve the problem of refugee status in this country specifically, and in this region. Why? Because there are a number of factors that come into play that that we've seen, particularly not only in terms of the social cultural norms that you're seeing, but also in terms of the kind of respect and dignity that is being meted or not being given to refugees in different areas, from not only our host governments, but also from our own peoples. People will refuse to sell other people phones. They'll refuse to sell people, other airtime, even data here, just because, again, you come from a different country. I think we need to really, I think digital won't solve that acceptance of people, is my sense immediately. It could even be a source of problems for those for specific refugees. Here I'm speaking about, for example, some research or some work we did in Nigeria, where in northern Nigeria, Facebook really caused essentially what was a genocide, because people were trying to flee the violence that was happening in northern Nigeria, but because of fake news, you would get then met with a lot more violence where you were going. So it's a double-edged sword. Digital inclusion is good when it's good, but it can also be harmful, and can be particularly harmful for those who are most at risk. So I think we have to sort of take it with both, sort of that kind of reverence, to understand in certain specific areas that you're able to do those interventions in a meaningful way that understands, what the reality is.
Absolutely. And actually, I'll just you just mentioned something which I will I'll tease or trail for both yourself, David, and our audience. Tomorrow, I'm hosting another webinar which I'll be recording with a journalist from Nigeria, speaking about exactly that, as well as also a journalist. Oh, I'm liking the celebration, David. As well as also a journalist in Bangladesh who are currently, well, hopefully, if you can join, they're currently experiencing internet shutdowns in Bangladesh, which is obviously having a real impact on disinformation. So, of course, digital inclusion is a double-edged sword, but let's try to end this on a bit of a positive note, and speak about the kind of the evolution of digital inclusion, hopefully in the next few years, maybe in the next decade. Let's turn to Miranda and Armin for this. So, what are kind of your predictions in terms of how digital inclusion will evolve within public service delivery, especially for those who are currently excluded from services, government services online? Miranda, let's start with you, and then let's turn to Armin.
Well, first of all, I have to say thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure listening to my fellow panelists. I think I once was talking to a lady from the Blind Institute in London, and she was saying, what started as accessibility, so wider gates for people in wheelchairs at train stations, has become, a useful tool for more of society. So now people with push chairs or people with lots of luggage, wide gates which were initially designed as increased accessibility, actually make us all more comfortable. So I hope we talk about differential inclusion less, and just greater accessibility and ease of use of services for everybody. Perfect.
And Armin, let's bring you in here. What do you kind of see as the kind of the future? What does the future hold? It's a big question, but yeah, I'd like you to try and tackle it.
I think we tend to be either overly optimistic or overly pessimistic about how the future will be. It's always either utopian or dystopian for us. I tend to be more positive, but a bit cautiously. I think that with the emergence and further development of AI technology, service delivery will improve. But I also see that a few months ago we had a conference in Georgia where we're actually discussing how unequal or unequitable AI access to AI and even more access to big data technology is for researchers from different countries. And even on the European continent, the divide is considerable. And if we include other continents, it becomes even more visible. So I hope that in different areas, in different spectrums, this divide will become smaller over time. But what I will end with, I think, at the end of the day, it's not digitalization that's the solution. It's good and effective leadership and governance that's going to change things. And I hope that policymakers and politicians who are trying to use digitalization as a response for their political drawbacks and missed opportunities will take this into account as well.
Amazing. Well, I'd like to kind of end just thinking about a point that Mohammed made earlier about the almost borderless nature, quasi-borderless nature of the internet in some regards. And well, even if you just look at today's discussion, I'm calling in from Chile, Mohammed's calling in from Saudi Arabia, Miran from the UK, I'm from Belgium, David from Kenya. And I really hope that international collaboration can really support the development of effective digital public service platforms that promote digital inclusion and that promote inclusion into government services, because no one should be excluded from those services, no matter someone's geography, no matter someone's socioeconomic background, no matter someone's gender, and numerous other factors that can play into that. So I'm really hopeful that more conversations like these can come to fruition, that can make real positive change and action, and that people can support projects, whether they're projects from NGOs or private sector, government, wherever that might be, to make for a more inclusive and equitable digital world and world itself. So I'd like to thank all of my guests. Oh, sorry, Mohammed, I could see you wanted to jump in there.
Sorry, I was just going to say that you have kind of ended with the actual true benefit of this digital capability that we have, which is frankly about democratizing information, knowledge, and giving access to meet people regardless where they may be sitting. But I want to also just leave one thing for us to be thinking about, which is how do we make this a really safe bet for all of us? Because I'm fearful of the model that we have today, the principles that we have today, especially around the social media platforms, is going to threaten this really great technology that we have at our disposal. And David just mentioned some of the negative outcomes of that. And unless governments start to take action on, and not just governments, the whole society needs to think about how do we make the whole social media spaces, the online world, safe for us so that we can trust it, we can be protected by it, and we can have responsible citizens operating in that space as well. That for me is the biggest challenge, that will enable all of us to live safely and consume and benefit from this great technology.
Absolutely. I think we can all agree with that. So yeah, thank you. Well, to you, Mohammed, to you, Miranda, to you, Arman, and to you, David, for making this such a wonderful discussion, for bringing hopefully information to to the listeners from across the globe who can participate in the benefits of the internet at the moment. Of course, I'd like to thank our sponsors at the GSR Foundation for making this conversation possible. And as always, thank you to our listeners, our viewers, for engaging with this discussion. And until next time, let's stay connected. Thank you.